Well, is there a globalist conspiracy to control everything we do, from our financial transactions, take away our cash, make us use their garbage central bank digital currencies? How about carbon footprint? You traveled too much this month. You took an airplane flight way too many times this month, so you can't get in your car and go visit grandma anymore. You're not allowed to buy gasoline this month. You can't do that. Why not go out and buy an electric car? You schlep, go out and do that because you'd be better for the globalists, right? What about our food supply? Highly processed food they want you to eat, these fake meat patties with 80 ingredients inside of them. And when you get cancer, then use our medicines as well. We made these medicines ready to go. It's all convenient, isn't it? It sure as hell feels like there is a globalist conspiracy right now.
So what's going on? Who's representing humanity? Is it the right people? Is it just the politicians who are being engaged with, or is there a bigger picture?
Oh, it's not the politicians. They're not involved in this. The politicians aren't even involved in governing their own societies any longer. I mean, who really believes this?
Yes.
You're in Australia, you're in a place that is utterly dominated by the United States and, let's say, the World Economic Forum, and probably let's throw in the Bilderberg Group, which are all the same. That's who runs your country. That's who runs my country. The politicians don't have any control over their own countries. And well, we talked about democracy earlier, and I mean, it's a fiction. People have to understand, like, this whole democratic veneer that we have that's all it is just a veneer. So we don't have a democratic system. What we have is a very hierarchical, oligarchic system that has to pretend it's democratic in order to keep people happy, because that is the ideology that we've had for the last 200, 250 years, and we're attached to that ideology. But the reality has never been that. The reality is always that the few rule over the many. All societies, no exception.
When Secretary of Defense James Forrestal visited Germany just after the war, he and others discovered the unusual technologies that the Germans had been working on. It was at this time that the upper levels of the United States military began to contemplate the unthinkable.
Project Paperclip, to me, is the point at which we made a deal with the devil. We sacrificed our soul for security. There was no reason we had to take on the Paperclip scientists. We had their documentation. We interrogated them. We interrogated Werner von Braun in Germany, Dornberger, all those guys. We had a lot of their documents. We found enormous caches of records and spare parts for aircraft and rockets and the V-2s. All of this we found. There was no need, really, to bring them all to the U.S. and make them citizens and basically replace the scientists that we had. Something was very fishy about that. And to this day, I think that's the point where we just crossed the line.
When we first discovered Project Paperclip, when I was back working for the Jesuit National Headquarters in Washington, D.C., we realized that the United States, at the very end of the Second World War, engaged in a very aggressive program to commandeer the German scientists that were working on the rocket program, the V-2 program in the United States. Really got much the better of the Soviet Union in that contest to try to commandeer these scientists, to try to get access to that military technology so the United States could use it to their advantage. And Project Paperclip was the code name for the actual effort to recruit these scientists. Well, recruit them, either threaten to put them in prison as war criminals or get them to come and work for us. And they, not surprisingly, chose the latter.
Truman, as president, ordered the Pentagon not to bring in Nazis into this program. He says, if these people have any kind of suspect backgrounds, we don't want them. I don't care what the value is. And the Pentagon basically ignored him completely. They doctored records, they changed things. They brought these guys in. Some of them were really vile. One or two we had to send back. They were that vile because people found out. But most of them they were problematic. And Paperclip we were doing because we were afraid the Soviets would get a hold of these scientists and they would get the technology. We wanted it first. So we're scrambling through Europe to get to all the documents and the personnel before the Soviets. And the Germans were more than happy to not be captured by the Soviets and be captured by the British or the Americans. So they were running in our direction anyway. Werner von Braun particularly. I mean, he was an opportunist from the word go. So all of these guys were running towards the American embrace and willing to just sign off on anything according to what we've learned. The Soviets were making the same kind of push, and they did get some scientists, and they got some of that, and it did help them with their programs. So Paperclip, though, started with, when I first started researching it, maybe 100 to 200, maybe 300 scientists. Now we know it was more than 1,000, pushing 2,000, maybe more. And that's just the ones we brought into the continental United States. That's not the ones we helped to escape to other parts of the world and set up one way or the other and protected. So we had Nazi war criminals everywhere, and the scientists were particularly valuable. And we had, you know, Otto Skorzeny, who was the famous Nazi commando, running an operation in Egypt composed of German rocket scientists, developing rocket technology for Egypt. So this was going on at a tremendous clip, and we couldn't trust these guys, and we had reasons not to trust them. They were screwing with the program. They were sabotaging it from the very beginning. They knew what they were doing, and they were in constant contact with the other scientists in Europe and in Russia. Their mail was not monitored. Nothing was censored.
And Operation Paperclip was the parallel program to another program that was called Operation Overcast, which is where the United States attempted to bring in all of the anti-communist, anti-Soviet, and anti-Eastern Bloc political intelligence officers of the Third Reich. So what happened is the United States basically harvested all of these leaders of the Third Reich and brought them in and put them in charge of major, not only the rocket program of the United States, but the covert intelligence operations of the United States. So that we started taking on this kind of authoritarian, fascist, national security state element. And so our rocket program had two different faces, the NASA face, the pretty face, this peaceful face, the romantic face. And there was this other clandestine operation of building bigger and bigger and bigger missiles with triple boosters, and so that we could deliver a payload right onto Moscow within a matter of minutes. So there's always been this schizophrenic quality to NASA and the rocket program in the United States. And Paperclip was the code name for the beginning of this kind of a schizophrenic program.
But there was no push for them, really. There was no motivation for them to help the United States. They didn't suddenly become patriotic Americans. You know, that doesn't happen. And there were a lot of personality problems with the Nazis we brought over. But that was Paperclip. It was very controversial. Roosevelt's widow railed against the program. Einstein held a conference at one point in New York City. They were all members of an event in which they said, we can't be doing this anymore. This is wrong. But they were considered to be leftists and socialists and, you know, quasi-communists, so they were ignored because the real enemy now was the Soviet Union. We're no longer at war with Germany. All is forgiven. The Holocaust was forgiven. The atrocities were forgiven. The fact that they killed 20 million Russians alone was not cause for concern any longer. Nothing was. And we remember that Patton, at the end of World War II, was urgently telling Truman, let me go to Russia, let me go to Moscow, let me take the troops that I have, plus the Germans, who know how to fight. We'll all go together and we'll take Russia back. We'll liberate Moscow. And Patton is saying we were shooting at the wrong enemy. One of Patton's famous lines. He liked the Germans that he captured. And this was a kind of the mentality of our American military at the time. The Germans are really great fighters. They have a great military operation. Their machine is wonderful. Plus they have all these great toys, all these secret weapons and stuff. They should be on our side, or we should be on their side, and we'll all go against the Soviet Union. And that was the mentality in the Catholic Church at the time as well. Let's go in bed with the Nazis because at least they're anti-communist. A lot of Americans felt that way in those days. They were more terrified of Russia than they were disgusted by the Nazis.
Although there was outrage that the United States was bringing in the so-called enemy into its most secret institutions, no one really tried to stop Operation Paperclip. It was the Germans' research into Die Glocke, or bell technology, that made their entrance into America so important. The Americans had toyed with anti-gravity technology before through the work of Nikola Tesla and T. Townsend Brown. This interest was realized in the famous Philadelphia experiment, in which a ship was made to disappear and reappear miles away. But it was only with the migration of German scientists after World War II that the United States got a jump start on these technologies.
Anti-gravity technology has been suppressed since the first studies showed that this was very feasible, and I think that it dates from the Los Angeles air raid incident of 1942, where the Army and the Navy were able to retrieve some craft that were shot down by the artillery barrage. And when they studied it, they actually found that these technologies, anti-gravity, were feasible, but the war effort meant that they couldn't really investigate it until the war was completed.
And in the 50s, you had people like T. Townsend Brown and others openly talking about gravity control, gravity research, doing anti-gravity. It was a topic that was being tossed around quite a bit. But suddenly, in the late 50s, they just put a lid on it. You didn't hear about this. You didn't hear about scientists talking about gravity control or artificial gravity or anything like that. Everything suddenly switched to rockets, jets. They also essentially suppressed knowledge of Tesla. And that was part of the thing, is that NASA and the military, they wanted us to think of space travel as being something that's done with rockets, lighting a big giant firecracker under your ass, and going to the moon. But Tesla died in 1943 during the war. If he had survived World War II and had in any way been part of our space program, we would have a completely different space program, one that would electric type of craft, anti-gravity, all of those things.
It was only once they went to Antarctica and found out what was really going on that they realized that the World War II has not ended. It's actually very serious, it's still ongoing, and they'd better be prepared to fight back. So what do they do to fight back? They start building up the national security state. This is where you have the OSS, or Office of Strategic Services, becoming transformed into the Central Intelligence Agency, or CIA. You have a much greater bureaucratic, secret structure.
What the 47 and 49 Act did as in combination was it allowed appropriations to claw money out of other agency budgets for the intelligence agencies on a non-transparent basis. So you have, what you did with the 47 and 49 Act was you created an infrastructure that allowed money to be secretly channeled to secret and very, from a technology standpoint, unbelievably important, powerful projects on a non-transparent basis. So there's no accountability. And one of the things I'll tell you as a former government regulator is without transparency, the shenanigans that go on, it is very hard to manage big pots of money without some kind of feedback and redundant transparency to kind of keep everybody in check.
Okay. Because if you're wondering why the financial world now makes no sense, I think this talk may give you some clues as to what may be going on behind the scenes. Now, this system of finance has to be entirely hidden. In other words, what I'm talking about now in this talk is not the black budget. I'm talking about something even deeper and even more off the books, all right? Now, this finance system, this hidden system of finance, was laid in the years immediately following World War II, and we'll get into the details in this talk. It's based to some degree, though not entirely, on the striking of a modus vivendi with the former Axis elites in order to utilize their funds and their talent and their technologies. So what we have, I'm suggesting to you, and what we will see as I outline in this talk, is the institution of financial fraud on an industrial scale that persists over several decades. I'm going to try and highlight what I think are three, not the only, but at least three of the major contributory factors that if we're going to reverse engineer the policy formation culture of the national security establishment that we have to look at. The first is obviously 1947. There's a huge UFO flap in the year 1947. I believe Richard Dolan at one point, when we talked recently, said that there were something like hundreds of them all over the world. The second thing that we're going to be talking about is a German-American engineer by the name of Alfred Leding, and the very first assessments that were done within the national security establishment. Remember, 1947 is also the year that President Truman signs the National Security Act, creating the CIA and the NSA into law. And as we're going to see a little later on, 1947 is a crucial year financially. All right? Leding offered the first assessments, and interestingly enough, we're going to see that the first thing that he suspects is somehow the Nazis are involved with this. But later on, Alfred Leding also offers, for very deliberate, very specific, very clear reasons, another hypothesis, not in opposition to the first one, but rather as a supplement to it. And that is, he thinks that some of it may be coming from off-world simply because we don't have the production capacity to produce all of these UFOs seen all over the world, oftentimes in the same time frame. The national security establishment had come to hold two things at the same time, not in opposition to each other, but as complements of each other. First, there's some secret human source, possibly independent Nazis, possibly some other group, that is behind some UFO reports. And secondly, it had also come to hold that no terrestrial explanation by itself could account for all of them, simply because of the enormous cost and production difficulty. Now, I keep saying enormous cost because obviously we're leading up to the financial problem here. So what are the implications of this? This means the United States national security military-industrial finance complex is confronted by a triple threat: communists, Nazis, UFOs. And that his response has to do four things. First of all, it has to develop technologies that can do triple duty, dealing with all three potential threats, not the least of which is finding out, if possible, where they're coming from and what they're doing. Secondly, since the UFO represented the greatest long-term potential, not imminent, potential threat, a long-term program had to be put into place to emulate its technological performance. And that requires, number three, a decades-long financial commitment. In other words, this is the This is the Manhattan Project on steroids. The Manhattan Project lasted 3.5 years. It cost billions of dollars, in 1945 dollars, incidentally. This is a problem that's going to require decades and funds in the trillions of dollars for decades. The fourth thing that it requires, therefore, is not only secrecy regarding the technological research aspects of it, but it will require extreme secrecy in the funding mechanism for it. Now let's look at this Axis loot for a moment, because everyone thinks about the Nazis going around Europe and plundering art treasures and stockpiling everything. Nobody remembers the Japanese. But in point of fact, throughout World War II, there was a Japanese operation called Operation Golden Lily. It was led by a member of the imperial household by the name of Prince Chichibu. So in other words, this is not even in the hands of the Kempeitai. It's not even in the hands of Japanese intelligence. This is directly an operation of the imperial house. And what they did is they went in. You think the Nazis set the level for efficiency of plunder? The Japanese went into Asia and China and Southeast Asia and literally suctioned every last scrap of any kind of precious metal, gold, silver, platinum, you name it, jewels, cash, artworks, ancient manuscripts, everything that they could lay their hands on to bring it back to Japan. This was called Operation Golden Lily. Now, this gentleman here, toward the end of the war, after the American invasion of the Philippine archipelago, learns about it. And his name is Captain, later General, Ed Lansdale. That name might be familiar to some of you JFK assassination researchers. Lansdale learned about Operation Gold Lily and all of this vast loot that was buried on Luzon and Mindanao and all over the Philippine Islands. And when he learned about it, he flew to Tokyo to debrief General MacArthur. And MacArthur said, well, that's interesting. I need you to get on a plane and fly to Washington and brief President Truman. We're talking again, folks, in 1945 dollars terms of billions of dollars. Billions. So Lansdale flies to Washington and briefs Truman. Now please note right at the bottom here, this is the beginning in 1947, not only of a black budget, but please understand me now, something completely separate and totally hidden. Truman, on learning of it, discusses it with his cabinet and, quote, decided to proceed with the recovery, but to keep it a state secret, unquote. Now, folks, at that moment, President Truman put the American intelligence apparatus in the banking business. At that moment. I leave it to you to work out all of the implications of that decision for what's going on right now, both domestically and internationally. Now, that bit of information, incidentally, if you don't know this work, it's a wonderful book discussing Operation Golden Lily called Gold Warriors. It's by Sterling and Peggy Seagrave. Now, there's another aspect to this story. This is what the Seagraves themselves state in Gold Warriors on page 3 a little later on. The treasure was combined with Axis loot recovered in Europe to create a worldwide covert political action fund to fight communism. This black gold gave the Truman administration access to virtually limitless unvouchered funds for covert operations. But I believe it goes beyond mere covert operations because, as I put it down here at the bottom of the slide, the sheer scale when you combine that Japanese loot and that Nazi loot, suggests to me, given the threefold strategic problem that we're facing, that much more than communism or covert operations against it, or even post-war Nazis or whoever else, but that the UFO was a long-term problem requiring that technological emulation. And if you're setting up a system of hidden finance, go back to what I said previously about Richard Bissell and the Rockefellers contributing their own personal private family funds to the development of the backup camera system for the early Corona satellites. Oh, we'll donate you the money. You don't have to tap the taxpayer. Go back to that element, and what you see now forming with this hidden system of finance is a nexus between this black projects world requiring its hidden system of finance, and that's going to demand, at some point, the participation off the books of the major prime banks of the West. It in turn implies something else. Since you're keeping all of that Japanese gold secret, it means that any amount or estimate of the amounts of gold that you see in the world today are probably badly obfuscated, and perhaps off as much as an order of magnitude. And that implies yet something else. Because if you're keeping this as a hidden system of finance, what you see you can do is you can take all that gold and all that silver and all those gems and all those bonds and all that liquid cash, move it into those participating prime banks, and keep it all off the books. That's your secret reserve. And you can rehypothecate that reserve over, because you see it's secret, over and over and over and over. In other words, what I'm telling you is exactly what Richard Dolan has said in his books. The UFO is not only the principal problem of post-war historiography, it's the principal hidden problem in finance. So let's look and sum it up. Truman's 1947 decision to keep all this Axis plunder a state secret implies truly profound and significant things for the long-term financial structure of the West. Number one, it implies the intelligence national security complex now entered the realm of international finance and banking directly. Number two, it implies that the intelligence community had to have, at a lower level of complicity, the participation of prime banks around the world to make such a system work. What I've just told you is that they are participants in a system ultimately involving fraud. Thirdly, it implies the further complex interface of the American intelligence national security oligarchy. After all, we're not going to be able to recover all that Axis loot without them telling us where it is. And they're going to drive, trust me, a hard bargain. So it requires the interface not only with their scientists, but with their managers, with their technical people, and as we saw with Galen, with who? With their intelligence people. To the point that we keep that intelligence network intact. The fourth thing it implies is the creation of a vast secret mechanism of finance, totally unaccountable to the public and their institutions of government. and increasing the dominant financial concern of the American federal government. Fifthly, it implies the creation of a vast secret mechanism of finance capable of the manipulation of markets, for example, the bullion markets. And finally, points 6 and 7. It rationalizes almost perfectly why there is such widespread numerical discrepancies in the various estimates of the amounts of various types of bullion actually in existence, allowing you to manipulate those markets. And 7, it rationalizes a hidden reason for the formation of the Bilderberg Group between the Rockefeller interests representing the new financial intelligence complex and Prince Bernhard, former manager of IG Farben Industry, and the consistent presence of Dr. Hermann Josef Ops, CEO of Deutsche Bank, at an early stage of the Bilderberg meetings, which becomes the mechanism for coordinating the movement of European Axis plunder directly and secretly into Western banks.
Every recession and depression throughout this century has been specifically engineered and designed by these people. Even though the Bilderbergers only began to formally meet in 1954, you had the stock market crash of 1929, which was engineered by J.P. Morgan. You had, of course, a cabal of European banks take over the banking system of the United States with the formation of the Federal Reserve. So these 12 member banks of the Federal Reserve that now print what is supposedly our money, which is not, they're not U.S. Treasury notes, they're Federal Reserve notes, that are privately printed, irredeemable in gold or silver promissory notes, and are an illegal de facto rather than de jure currency in the U.S. Yes, they have been the perpetrators of every recession and every depression that this country's seen, and have been behind the constant, nonstop war that the 20th century really became. I mean, starting with the First World War, you can see the entire 20th century is just one long war. First World War, everybody stops and repopulates, rearms. Second World War, then you have the Cold War, then you have Korea, then you have Vietnam, then you have the various adventures, if you will, around the world.
Well, wars are big business. Wars are money makers, and these are the military-industrial complex bomb makers. These are the people that are the ones that are making the money off of the wars, the finances, the destruction, the coordination of the resources once the war has taken place. And so war is a racket, as General Smedley Butler once said, and that can't ring more true than it is today.
Reinhard Gehlen was an SS general, and he was actually head of the eastern forces of the SS. And so he was an intelligence expert on the Russians and the Russian military for the Germans. At the end of World War II, Reinhard Gehlen was able to surrender to the British and the Americans, who gladly took him in as an intelligence partner. Reinhard Gehlen was certainly one of the most knowledgeable people in the Third Reich on intelligence matters, and involving, of course, Germany, but also of the Russians as well.
At the end of the war, he had whole trainloads of files and information on anti-communist activities in Russia. So he came to the Allies, the Americans particularly, and he said, look, you guys are going to be facing the Russians. You don't know anything about them. They've been infiltrating spies into the United States since the World War I, and said, but I have all the information, and if you will let me provide the information, I can give you the intelligence you need to combat the Soviets. And they did. The deal was cut.
And the United States government basically took Gehlen and made him really an OSS officer, and later as a CIA asset in a sense.
He had two qualifications at least. One of them, he said, don't ask me to provide any intelligence that might harm my home country, my fatherland, okay, which shows he was an unreconstructed Nazi. Okay, and two, he said, if there becomes a intelligence service in Germany again, I want to be the head of it. And sure enough, he became head of West German intelligence. Now, the key to all this is, the meaning is really pretty incredible. Because what this means is that after World War II, immediately after World War II, and going into the Cold War, the information we were getting out of Russia was coming from an anti-communist underground filtered through a Nazi organization. No wonder we had the Cold War. No wonder we thought Russia was trying to take over the world. It's amazing.
It was through Reinhard Gehlen that the Americans were able to engineer what was called Project Paperclip. And that was to bring all of these Nazi scientists, particularly aerospace and other technicians, rocket scientists and stuff, and people who worked at Peenemünde, including Wernher von Braun, to the United States.
What we know for sure is at the end of the Second World War, that the British, the Americans, and the Russians essentially grabbed as much material as they could, and also the scientists. For example, the US had Operation Paperclip, which was designed to bring as many Nazi scientists over to the US to continue the rocket-based programs out at the White Sands missile range, as it's called today. It used to be called the White Sands Proving Ground. Many of the German scientists were sent there where they worked on essentially the German V2 rocket. It was just a continuation. And of course, you know, one of those was Wernher von Braun, who became one of the leading figures in NASA later on. So in other words, we've got this paper trail and people trail as well, going from Nazi Germany through Paperclip, right through NASA, through the 60s and 70s, and all interconnected.
One thing that people have to realize too is that as the war was lost by the Germans, the British and the Russians, because of the vicious fighting that they had been in, there wasn't really a way that the British, say, could bring a bunch of Nazi scientists to Britain and have them work in the British space program. That just wouldn't have flown, shall we say. But with the largesse of the United States and America's friendly relationships, really, with Germans and other Europeans, the United States was able to bring in these scientists, these Nazi scientists, without a lot of hullabaloo or questioning. And even within the military, there wasn't some big opposition to bringing these Nazi scientists to the US. And that's what Paperclip was really all about.
Now, the people who were working in the US defense community thought that they had the might and the willpower to be able to smash out the Germans, when in fact the other is what took place. The Germans were more cunning, they were more ruthless, and because all this was done under the cloak of secrecy, they could gain control over this military-industrial complex, and nobody out there in the open would ever know anything about it. What are they going to do? Complain? Oh yeah, the Germans took over all this secret stuff that we haven't told you that we have. There was nothing they could do. The Germans took over, and it's all remained classified right up until the present.
Most of these Nazi scientists ended up in aerospace in one way or another, even working for NASA, and they worked in New Mexico, at Alamogordo, and at Roswell. Ultimately, in the end, Wernher von Braun, a Paperclip scientist, became the head of NASA and the director of it. And Americans just accepted that without question, really.
Parsons loses his security clearance. Another member of the Suicide Squad, Frank Molina, his close friend, loses his security clearance. Their co-worker, H.S. Tian, the brilliant Chinese engineer, accused completely unfairly of being a communist, loses his security clearance. Everybody who helped develop our space program from California, the people who invented the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, who founded it, all lost their security clearances, never worked again. But they were replaced by the Paperclip scientists. So now we're bringing in Wernher von Braun, we're bringing in Hermann Oberth, on and on and on. We're bringing in all these Nazi scientists, people who were our enemies, people that we know should never have a security clearance, people who fought against us in World War II, developed the weapons of mass destruction that Hitler used. We got those guys and brought them to the United States, and we fired the guys who helped our space program, claiming they were kind of lefty. Doesn't matter, they're out of here. They're just too eccentric.
Not only did NASA have some early pioneers who were interested in the occult, but we've also seen that the very origins of NASA itself have a large German component via Operation Paperclip. That leaves this question begging for an answer. What is NASA?
Well, I think NASA was a front that was created to basically sideline many scientists, engineers, the general public from the possibilities of anti-gravity. If you look at the 1950s, which is the critical phase in terms of the study of anti-gravity, you see that there were a number of journals, especially in Britain, that released peer-reviewed papers. Anti-gravity was being studied in aviation journals. You had a number of companies. We know the Douglas Aircraft Company was doing extensive studies on anti-gravity. And these were showing that it was feasible and that this is something that could be used for generating aerospace vehicles, flying saucers. So then what happens is you have NASA kind of being formed at the end of the Eisenhower administration. And NASA basically is focused on space exploration using conventional rocket propulsion. And some of the chief NASA scientists leading these projects were Project Paperclip personnel. These were former Nazis, like for example Werner von Braun. He was the head of the Redstone Army Arsenal for missile technology, and when NASA was formed he was instantly transferred over to being the director of the Marshall Space Flight Center out of Huntsville, Alabama. You had Kurt Debus, another Nazi scientist, former SS officer, being the head of the space program out of NASA Florida Center there, Kennedy Space Center. The whole NASA program was a misdirection from the feasibility of anti-gravity, which was being secretly studied in black projects by companies such as Douglas and Northrop Grumman and Lockheed and others for the military, for the Army, US Air Force, for the US Navy, that were all trying to get these companies to build anti-gravity vehicles for them, but were not going to be released to the public for national security reasons and because of the power of the oil lobby.
In December 1960, a NASA-commissioned report was released to the public. Called the Brookings Report because it was researched and authored by the Brookings Institution, the Brookings Report asked the big question: what would happen to our planet, our beliefs, and our way of life if NASA discovered extraterrestrial life, or even just extraterrestrial artifacts? Their answer may surprise you.
The Brookings Report was right next door to our office at the Jesuit National Headquarters in Washington, D.C. That in 1960, they were asked to do a confidential report to determine what effect the discovery of extraterrestrial intelligence, highly technologically developed intelligence, would have on the American people in global politics and the economy, et cetera. And the Brookings Institution, just barely left of center, kind of liberal organization, actually came up with the fundamental conclusion that it would be probably better to keep it secret.
And clearly, if you look at some of the MJ-12 documents, the presidents were involved. Truman and Eisenhower were involved, but then I think somebody on the inside got the idea that the president shouldn't be involved. They locked Kennedy out of it. There's even a memo that says Lancer, who was John F. Kennedy's Secret Service nickname, is making inquiries and we cannot allow this. And I think what Kennedy decided is, I'm going to make my own secret space program and I'm going to make it based on a public space program. So we're going to go to the moon. So he took all of the resources that were at his, that he had control over, and put them into a public space program that also had a private aspect which used other advanced technology. So I think there have been two parallel secret space programs, and the question is which one of them has won out at this point, and we really don't know.
In January 27, 1967, NASA astronauts Virgil Grissom, Edward White, and Roger Chaffee were performing a launch simulation when a fire broke out in their module. This incident and the ensuing investigation would be one of the many proving the space agency deserved its frequently used moniker in the truth community: never a straight answer.
In Apollo 1, Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee were actually going to do a full-on test of the Apollo 1 capsule. They actually went up into the capsule, and while they were in there, they were locked and sealed in. Within a few minutes, all of a sudden, unexplicably, they lost communication with the command center. Now, this is very bizarre because there's three forms of communication, and all three went out. So you can imagine the horror probably on these guys' faces when they realized they couldn't get any communication whatsoever, and they were locked in the capsule.
The Apollo 1 fire is still kind of a mystery to this day. There were issues with the Apollo design. The astronauts had complained about a lot of stuff. They complained that they were testing in a 100% pure oxygen environment, which is very, very flammable. There was way too much Velcro and items on the spacecraft that could have burned. And lo and behold, when they did this high pressure test on Apollo 1, there was some sort of spark, which to this day, nobody really knows what sparked, which caused a fire that burned very, very quickly and killed the astronauts, burned them to death, suffocated them in the smoke in just minutes before they could even get the hatch back.
Now, before that happened, Gus Grissom was noted as saying that someone's gonna die. And he was being very critical of the NASA space program.
But what's interesting about the Apollo 1 fire is that it happened at a time when there's certain stellar alignments right above the landing site, which have been shown repeatedly to be an homage to ancient Egyptian gods like Isis and Osiris. In this case, it was Orion's belt, 33 degrees above the launch pad at the time. And on board was Gus Grissom. Gus Grissom was supposed to be the first man to walk on the moon, not Neil Armstrong. He was one of the original Mercury 7 astronauts, and he had made a lot of complaints about the fact that, you know, as far as he was concerned, he was just spamming a cam in his crappy Apollo program, and he knew very well that we had already been to the moon and Mars, and he told people this, that we have much more highly advanced spacecraft that have traveled to the moon and traveled to Mars, and, you know, we're just basically crash test dummies. And he had lamented that, he criticized NASA, and it seems to be kind of a convenient coincidence that a guy that had a reputation as a maverick, as a free thinker, as a guy who would say what was on his mind and didn't have a great filter, was one of the 3 men who was killed that day. And in fact, it got so bad, he was complaining so much about what was wrong with the spacecraft that he actually hung a lemon on the Apollo 1 capsule at one point. Forward.
Even though he had already went on several space flights and was a national hero. So there's definitely something going on there behind the scenes, because even Gus Grissom's family, for many, many years after, had contacted NASA and really wanted to get answers as to exactly what happened, and they never did. They never got clarification, they never got closure. And the actual capsule itself is still sitting in a military bunker somewhere, sealed off, and nobody can get access to it.
Why were so many red flags in this mission ignored? And is it possible that this was much more than a simple accident? What was NASA trying to hide?
Well, you know, when people ask about this agency or that agency suppressing information, the first thing to talk about is to understand that NASA, in the rank and file, isn't suppressing anything, nor is, for that matter, the Department of Defense. You have to begin to ask the question, are there compartmented operations within various agencies, some of which work together and some don't, that have information they're suppressing? The answer to that is yes, no question about it. And NASA has had information. We landed on the moon. There was footage filmed of what Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin saw. And I know this for a fact. I know members of their family personally who, they said, have related this, that there were UFOs on the crater all around where we sat down, which is why some of the film footage that people saw was actually fake. I deal with facts, not opinions. The nature of compartmented intelligence, and it doesn't matter what agency you're talking about, is that people make these sweeping generalizations. The government is hiding information about UFOs. Well, I can tell you from briefings I've had with senators and generals and senior officials in every administration since 1993 that most people in the government don't know anything about this subject. And it's so highly compartmented. I saw a chart not long ago that had the President of the United States at about level 21, and this issue is around 38 or 40, dealing with the UFO issue. In other words, beyond what is the President would normally be read in on. And there are highly compartmented and illegal projects going on that are not being overseen constitutionally and legally, and that this is a threat to the national security and to world security. And so at NASA, certainly there are some people read into this. And I'll give you a good example. Back in the 90s, in the late 90s, there was a woman who was one of the 5 directors of NASA in divisions. And hers was the mission to planet Earth, doing satellite imaging of the climate change and all this sort of thing. And she was very interested in what we were working on because I had connected the dot between UFO secrecy and the suppression of the energy technologies that would get us off fossil fuels and nuclear power, et cetera. So she actually brought this issue up to Dan Golden, the director of NASA. But he had been on the board of and director of Science Applications International Corporation, which is one of the crown jewels of contracting for the secret government programs dealing with UFOs. They were flying on the private jet of the director of NASA, and Dan Golden looked at her, was looking down at the city below, and said, "The masses are asses. They don't know anything, and they don't need to know anything." Clearly indicating he did, and shut her down, wouldn't talk about it. And so I give this as just one example of here is someone, an incredibly highly ranking person in NASA, open-minded and interested in the subject, who could find nothing through channels. We did the briefing for her, and then she asked the director of NASA, and he just basically says, "No one needs to know about this, be quiet." And so people have to understand that that is how the system is set up, and many times being run completely illegally, where the oversight committees in the Congress or the president, and this is true in Great Britain and Australia as well, and Canada, they'll make a directed inquiry into this subject and will be told nothing, or will be told, "We won't tell you."
As Kennedy was planning, if he had become the president, he was going to dissolve the CIA, get us out of Vietnam, disclose this information, and make peace with the Soviet Union. That's what he was going to do. And those folks in the intelligence community and the warmongers and the profiteers and the military-industrial complex said, "Like bloody hell you will." And that was the end of him.
You know, sometimes history gets it wrong, and this is certainly true in the JFK assassination. The recent media circus around the 50th anniversary of this event proved that there are still powerful forces committed to keeping the truth on this subject hidden. These forces have desperately tried to put the genie back in the bottle, but they can't. Over 70% of Americans don't believe in the official story of events. They know the media had a hand in this deception. Seasoned researchers have brought forward compelling evidence that there was far more to this story than was revealed. But the corporate media would like to take us back to when the Warren Commission was the last word. A lone assassin, a magic bullet, and no questions asked. In this program, we're going to present real facts that show Lee Harvey Oswald was not the assassin of President Kennedy, and that he was, without a doubt, an intelligence asset for the CIA. We'll start by examining the key elements that were used to portray Oswald as the lone assassin by the Warren Commission. We're all aware that Oswald is supposed to have performed the shooting by using a Mannlicher Carcano rifle, but what has been suppressed is that there was a different rifle found at the scene by an alert sheriff's deputy named Roger Craig. Craig's compelling testimony begins here.
And Boone was ahead of me by about 8 feet. And there were a stack of boxes just at the head of the stairwell going downstairs. And Boone looked over into it and said, "Here it is. Here's the rifle." So I immediately went over beside him and looked over, and there was a rifle. But we didn't touch it until Captain Fritz and Lieutenant Day from the ID department of the Dallas Police Department got there. Now, Captain Fritz was the chief of homicide. Lieutenant Day was from the Identification Bureau. They got there and took some pictures of the rifle. And then I believe Dave pulled the rifle out and handed it to Captain Fritz, who held it up by the, had a strap on it. He held it up by the strap and asked if anyone knew what kind of rifle it was. Well, by this time, Deputy Constable Seymour Weitzman had joined us. And Weitzman was a gun buff. He had a sporting goods store at one time. He was very good with weapons. And he said it looks like a Mauser. And he walked over to Fritz. And Captain Fritz was holding the rifle up in the air. And I was standing next to Weitzman. who were standing next to Fritz, and we weren't any more than 6 or 8 inches from the rifle, and stamped right on the barrel of the rifle was 7.65 Mauser. And that's when Weitzman said it is a Mauser and pointed to the 7.65 Mauser stamp on the barrel.
Craig's shocking testimony about the rifle being a different model than Oswald's Mannlicher Carcano threatened to bring down the official version of events. He was soon fired from the police department on a pretext and found himself the target of a witness elimination program. Several attempts were made on his life, and he became disabled. Finally, in May 1975, he was found with a shotgun blast to his chest. The ruling was suicide. The single magic bullet theory was the life raft the Warren Commission clung to in order to accuse Oswald of being the lone assassin. This bullet, that supposedly caused 7 wounds and was still in pristine condition, has become a punchline in popular culture for describing something absurd. Yet without it, there is no case against Oswald as the sole shooter. Dr. Cyril Wecht, a respected forensic pathologist who's worked on such high-level cases as the O.J. Simpson trial, gives us his reasoning for coining the term the magic bullet.
The single bullet theory, which I described a long time ago as the magic bullet theory. Connolly sitting directly in front of the president. The bullet is coming now, and it's going right from up downward, from right to left, and from back to front. Comes out, exits the president's neck. Here's Connolly. The bullet in midair stops, comes back about 18 inches, and hits John Connolly behind the right armpit. Not the left armpit, not the left shoulder, behind the right armpit. It goes into his chest, pierces the lung, destroys 4 inches of the right fifth rib. And Connolly is a big bone, 6'4" Texan, destroys 4 inches of the bone, exits from below the level of the nipple. When you look at the Zapruder film, you'll see John Connolly holding the white Stetson hat like this. Here's the hat, right here, at this level. And at that point, he's been shot. And the bullet has emerged below the level of the nipple. The bullet comes out then, and moving downward, it swings upward and comes up and around, and hits in the back of his wrist, produces a comminuted fracture of the radius, one of the 2 large bones that come from the elbow to the wrist. Comminuted means a fragmented fracture, exits from the front of the right wrist, moves down into a left thigh, and the bullet that Tomlinson, the maintenance man, found at Parkland Hospital under the stretcher, which on the night of the autopsy was from President's back, which the next day was from the President's neck, 5 months later is from Connolly's left thigh. You with me? I hope it hasn't been too long a day. You have to be mentally agile to keep up with this bullet.
Dr. Jeremy Gunn, the general counsel for the Assassination Record Review Board, shares Dr. Wecht's view.
The bullet would have been completely deformed with Commission Exhibit 399. The magic bullet has almost no damage to it at all. So that, to me, is just not believable that Commission Exhibit 399 did all of that damage. Even if one bullet could have done it, it was not Commission Exhibit 399. And that's really the linchpin for what the Warren Commission was finding.
There's a strange twist to how this bullet was found in this archive clip.
The bullet was found here in this area, and not on that stretcher. That's the stretcher I took off the elevator.
The stretcher he took off the elevator was Connolly's, so Tomlinson found the bullet on a different stretcher not connected to the case. This led critics to claim the bullet was planted.
Was the bullet planted? This strange encounter by a Dallas reporter at Parkland Hospital may give us a clue.
A group of nurses and doctors standing around with a lot of concern, and Jack Ruby came up to me. He said something to the effect that, "Isn't this just terrible?" And he looked as if he was extremely distressed. I shook hands with him, and it was very clear to me who I had talked to and who I had called by name and who had called me by name and who I had shaken hands with and everything. But when the Warren Commission report came out, they said that probably under the stress of everything that was going on, that I most likely was confused, and that I talked to Ruby at the police station several hours later. I was dismayed when I picked up my copy of the Warren Commission report and discovered what what they had decided about my testimony. And among other things, I immediately began to wonder, you know, who else they had talked to, who they chose not to believe, and why.
Victoria Adams worked in the Texas School Book Depository building. Her testimony about being on the stairs when Oswald was assumed to have been rushing down them posed a problem for the Warren Commission. Author Mary Ernest tells us her story.
The scenario is that in its 888-page report, her story was reduced to only 2 paragraphs. In a nutshell, what she did was, following the shots, the third shot, she and a co-worker who were on the 4th floor of the building, they were employees there, left that window and ran out through the rear office door and down the back stairs. It was a very innocent act. She didn't realize the significance of it. As soon as she brought up the fact that she had ran down the stairs seconds after the final shot, moments after the final shot, then they were all ears. That seemed to bother them. She said she couldn't understand why, but they continually asked her about those questions. When the Warren report was issued, it dismissed her, even though it didn't do any of the time tests that it has done on other people involving the escape of Oswald. It didn't even mention in the Warren report that the woman, another woman, had accompanied her down the stairs. Her name was Sandra Stiles.
And then they turned left onto Elm Street. And as it got just past the turn, we heard the 3 shots coming from we didn't know where. So we went down the stairs to the 2nd floor, out the back door, and around the west side of the building, around to the front, where we encountered a motorcycle policeman who asked us where we came from. And we told him the 4th floor, and he said, go back the way you came. So we immediately went back up the stairs and back up to our office. Except for my co-worker, I didn't see or hear anyone else on the stairwell that day. I did not see Lee Harvey Oswald at all or hear any sounds to indicate that there was anyone else on the stairwell at the same time.
Officer Marion Baker rushed into the depository building and encountered Oswald only 90 seconds after the shooting in the 2nd floor coffee room. He describes what happened here.
As we came out of on the 2nd floor, I saw through a doorway, a window in this doorway, a movement. So I went over and opened up the door, and this man was walking away from it. And the next room, I later found out was a coffee room. I called to the man, and he turned around, and Mr. Trudy was there beside me. I asked him if he knew this man or if he worked there. He said, yes, he does. He was calm, ordinary, you know. He didn't look excited or anything like that.
The so-called evidence the Warren Commission produced was never subjected to the legal standards of a murder trial. Instead, they relied on projecting the idea that Oswald was guilty in the court of public opinion. The best example of this was the so-called backyard photos that purported to show Oswald with the alleged murder weapon. Now, of course, we know just how easy it is to alter a photograph, therefore, as evidence, it's of no value. Judge Jim Garrison weighed in on a key piece of evidence that suggests Oswald was not the shooter.
The paraffin test would show whether or not you fired a rifle. The results were available before the end of the day. They showed that Oswald had not fired a rifle. But the way that that was handled was it was announced to the world that the paraffin test showed that he had fired a rifle.
Chief, we understand you have the results of the paraffin test which were made to determine whether Oswald had fired a weapon. Can you tell us what those tests show?
I understand that it was positive.
The fingerprints on the boxes added up to the fingerprints of a large number of policemen, one unidentified man, and no fingerprints of Lee Oswald.
The evidence in this case had a tendency to suddenly change when it was required that no loose ends be left hanging. For example, Dallas police initially reported that they'd found only 2 bullet shell casings and gave them to the FBI. When the Warren Commission used the same report in their findings, the number magically changed to 3 spent shells instead of 2. A pattern we've seen before, getting the evidence to match the preordained conclusion, not using the real evidence to reach a real conclusion. When it came to fingerprints on the rifle, we can observe this pattern again. The rifle held no fingerprints of Lee Oswald, and this looked bad to investigators trying to link Oswald to the shooting. The rifle was sent to the FBI for further analysis, and still nothing. Then, after a few weeks, it was announced that a smudged palm print was discovered on the rifle, and suddenly it matched. Oswald's mortician shares some insight on this matter.
I had gotten to the funeral home with his body something in the neighborhood of 11 o'clock at night, and it is a several-hour procedure to prepare the remains. And after this time, someplace in the early morning, agents came. Now, I say agents because I'm not familiar at the moment with whether they were Secret Service or FBI or what they were, but agents did come, and when they did come, they fingerprinted. And the only reason that we knew they did, they were carrying a satchel and the equipment and asked us if they might have the preparation room to themselves. And after it was all over, we found ink on Lee Harvey's hands showing that they had fingerprinted him and palm printed him. We had to take that ink back off in order to prepare him for burial and to eliminate that ink.
Obviously, with no chain of evidence for the rifle and mysterious visits to Oswald's corpse, the palm print appears to be another false entry in the record and would not stand up to any normal legal standard. But we must ask ourselves, if the palm print was faked and a different rifle was found on the second floor and the magic bullet was just an absurd device to make Oswald look guilty, then what would have happened had he lived and gone to trial? Dr. Jeremy Gunn gives us his view.
I think that if Oswald had gone to trial and a judge had properly applied the rules of evidence and a jury had made finding of facts based upon the law, Oswald would have been found not guilty, because most of the evidence the Warren Commission used would not have been admissible in a trial against Lee Harvey Oswald.
Even in the early investigations of researchers like Mark Lane, the subject of Oswald's relationship with the CIA kept coming up. His high security clearance, his proximity to covert operations, led New Orleans DA Jim Garrison to investigate his intelligence connections, and he found that there were many.
If you, the people of the United States, will learn the truth that the president was assassinated by men who were once connected with a Central Intelligence Agency, of course, this might reflect on the dignity of the CIA. But I happen to believe that our form of government is strong enough to survive the truth. I am trying to tell you that there is no question as a result of our investigation that an element of the Central Intelligence Agency of our country killed John Kennedy, and that the present administration is concealing the facts. There is no question about it at all.
That is your opinion?
No, it is not. I know it, and if you will just wait, you will see that history will support this as fact. If you just keep in mind who profited most from the assassination, and then ask yourself some questions. Who appointed the members of the Warren Commission? And who runs the CIA, which has concealed a tremendous amount of evidence?
The problem for the Warren Commission was Oswald's involvement with the CIA and the highly secretive Ex-Protect wing that operated in the interest of intelligence and aerospace groups to protect the exotic X technology in the UFO file. The first issue was, if Oswald were to be portrayed as a communist, they would need to explain his work during the summer before the assassination for the right-wing former head of the Chicago FBI office, Guy Bannister, in New Orleans. Bannister's office at 544 Camp Street was a focal point of anti-communist activity, and he was often referred to as to the right of Attila the Hun. How would a communist-leaning leftist who had lived in the Soviet Union find himself working with Bannister? When leaflets that Oswald had been handing out were discovered with Bannister's address on them, more witnesses came forward to say Oswald had worked for Bannister. A series of strange deaths followed these revelations, and these connections were kept out of official investigations. The New Orleans District Attorney Jim Garrison had come across these curious links when putting his case together against Clay Shaw in the JFK assassination. He knew Bannister from his FBI days, and began to realize that Oswald had been set up.
Lee Harvey Oswald killed no one at all. So the point is, it wasn't a question of being alone or with anybody. He had nothing to do with the assassination.
Garrison believed that Bannister was the key to unraveling what was really behind the JFK assassination. Bannister's background in the FBI reveals the curious fact that he originated the X-Files, creating the name identification for UFO cases that he investigated for the Bureau. When Bannister died shortly before the Warren Commission was released in 1964, federal officials destroyed all of his files. However, a small set of file names were preserved by his wife, who eventually gave them to a local library. The file names give us an idea of what Bannister and his private detective agency front was really pursuing. One bombshell item of interest listed below the JFK assassination was Dinosaur Space Warcraft. This project, officially the Boeing X-20 Dinosaur, was originally conceived in Nazi Germany. One of the Paperclip scientists brought over to create an X-series of space planes was Walter Dornberger, who was a general in the SS and Werner von Braun's superior in the Nazi rocket program. Dornberger was originally slated to face death at Nuremberg for crimes against humanity by using inhumane methods on his slave labor population building the V-2 rockets. After his release and move to America, Dornberger had landed the post of vice president of Bell Helicopter in 1952. Dornberger's understudy at Bell was a promising engineer named Michael Payne, the son of the inventor of the Bell helicopter, Arthur Young. Payne and his wife, Ruth, hosted Lee Harvey Oswald and his Russian wife, Marina, at their home in Irving, Texas. Most of the incriminating evidence against Oswald, including the controversial backyard photo supposedly showing Oswald holding a rifle and a pistol, along with communist literature, which photo experts have repeatedly shown were tampered with, seem to indicate the plan for making Oswald the patsy started very early. On November 23, 1963, the day after the assassination, Irving Police Captain Paul Barger reported that a telephone repairman had overheard a male voice, presumably Michael Payne, speaking from the Payne household in a telephone call, saying he did not feel Oswald was responsible, and he further stated, quote, "We both know who is responsible," unquote. Researchers later claimed the info had come from an FBI wiretap of Payne's phone, but he was never questioned about it. Dornberger was at the very core of the X technology program, and his greatest achievement, the X-15, still holds the record for a manned space plane set 60 years ago. The presence of Oswald at the home of Ruth and Michael Payne, with their deep connections to Dornberger, shows the tentacles of aerospace interests reaching into the major assassinations. Far from being the drifter and loser that the Warren Commission had portrayed him as, Oswald had actually been stationed at a high security position in Atsugi in Japan during the development of the secret U-2 plane. In the summer before the JFK assassination, Oswald, while working at the Riley Coffee Company, which was a CIA front, was telling his fellow employees that he was going to work for NASA, which was why he was moving to Texas. When New Orleans DA Jim Garrison inquired about Oswald's fellow employees at Riley, he learned the odd fact that most of his co-workers had gone on to jobs at NASA or other aerospace companies. During the height of Garrison's investigation into Clay Shaw and the JFK assassination, he got in touch with Warren Hinkle, the publisher of Ramparts magazine, telling him it was urgent that they speak immediately. Hinkle's account follows. "This is urgent," Jim Garrison said. "Can you take this in the mailroom?" They'd never think to tap the mailroom extension. Garrison began talking when I picked up the mailroom extension. "This is risky, but I have little choice. It is imperative that I get this information to you now. Important new evidence has surfaced. Those Texas oil men do not appear to be involved in President Kennedy's murder in the way we first thought. It was the military-industrial complex that put up the money for the assassination. But as far as we can tell, the conspiracy was limited to the aerospace wing. I've got the names of 3 companies and their employees who were involved in setting up the president's murder. Do you have a pencil?" I wrote down the names of the 3 defense contractors. Garrison identified them as being Lockheed, Boeing, and General Dynamics. and the names of those executives in their employ whom the district attorney said had been instrumental in the murder of Jack Kennedy. I said that I had everything down, and Garrison said a hurried goodbye. It's poor security procedure to use the phone, but the situation warrants the risk. I wanted you to have this in case something happens. The investigation trail led Garrison directly to the aerospace companies developing the X technology in the UFO file. His arrest of Clay Shaw was a shot across the bow. It would eventually be revealed that Shaw had been a CIA asset and had a murky trail of associates, including David Ferry, a CIA pilot who had worked closely with Guy Bannister. Ferry was also an expert hypnotist. Garrison discovered that Ferry had been Oswald's squad commander in the Civil Air Patrol when Oswald was only 15. The grooming of Oswald by Ferry and intelligence services had paid off when he was selected as the patsy for the JFK assassination. Garrison was planning to bring Ferry to trial for conspiracy. Instead, Ferry died mysteriously and left behind typed suicide notes. Garrison's case against Clay Shaw collapsed. The CIA had worked overtime behind the scenes to undermine it, according to Victor Marchetti, an assistant to CIA Director Richard Helms. The media would also be used to demonize Garrison's efforts at revealing the truth. When Garrison's Shaw trial was over in 1969, a mysterious document appeared, leaked by an unknown insider who called himself William Torbett. The document revealed a previously unknown government division called Defense Industrial Security Command, or DISC, which was described as a NASA security division, headed by former Nazi rocket scientist Werner von Braun. The Torbett document identified the following individuals as DISC agents: Guy Bannister, Clay Shaw, David Ferry, Lee Harvey Oswald, and Louis Mortimer Bloomfield. Bloomfield had headed up Permindex, a CIA front World Trade Company that specialized in assassinations and was based in Montreal. The earliest blueprint for a group linked directly to X-Protect had been revealed in the mysterious Torbett document. President Kennedy's desire to open the UFO file and share it with the Russian government for purposes of a joint moon mission, as demonstrated in National Security Action Memorandum 271 and his November 12th memo to the director of the CIA. Kennedy had struggled his entire presidency with the out-of-control intelligence community to reassert presidential power over their unconstitutional actions. He mused to aides in private that he was going to smash the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the wind. A major piece of this effort was reasserting control over the UFO file that had been lost at the end of the Eisenhower administration. E. Howard Hunt, the CIA super spy, best known as the coordinator of the Watergate burglars, revealed to his close friend and attorney for the Watergate 7, Douglas Caddy, the nature of the desperate struggle between JFK and the CIA over the UFO file. Caddy revealed to me what Hunt told him in this interview.
And then we walked out, and on the street there I thought, well, this is the last time I'll see Howard. I'm going to make one more stab, okay, at seeing if I can get something here, you know. And I said, well, Howard, why was John Kennedy assassinated? He said, why was John Kennedy assassinated? He said, John Kennedy was assassinated because he was about to give our most vital secret to the Soviets. About to give our most vital secret to the Soviets. And I was stunned by that. I mean, John Kennedy, our president, Soviets, and I never even heard about such a thing. And I said, well, what was that? And at that point, he leaned forward and looked right in my eyes, directly in my eyes, and he said, the alien presence. And he reached out and shook my hand, and then turned and walked away. And that was the last time I saw Howard Hunt. It didn't mean that much to me. I knew it was important, but it did not mean that much. There's no way I could, and the alien presence, I was not really familiar with that either, you know. But I remembered it. I knew it was important.
This breakthrough revelation from a top CIA officer to his friend in private gives us the real mandate of X-Protect. Any official, even the president, who wants to reveal the true nature of the X technology in the UFO file must be eliminated. They've used this protocol for decades, but their attempt. As we remember those who have fallen while fighting X-Protect, we must remember we can move our culture forward by destroying the wall of secrecy erected by these covert organizations. The only way we can do it is to expose X-Protect and the lethal means that they've used to control every aspect of society. In the final analysis, if we are to understand the power structure on planet Earth, we must understand the X-Protect and hold them accountable for their actions. The whole world is watching and waiting.
In the 3 years after the murders of President Kennedy and Lee Harvey Oswald, 18 material witnesses died, 6 by gunfire, 3 in motor accidents, 2 by suicide, 1 from a cut throat, 1 from a karate chop to the neck, 3 from heart attacks, and 2 from natural causes. An actuary engaged by the London Sunday Times concluded that on November 22, 1963, the odds against these witnesses being dead by February 1967 were 100,000 trillion to 1.
I think it's only prudent that we expect the world's wealthiest 0.001% to fight tooth and nail to hold on to what they've got and to act in their best interests, not ours. So what does that mean? It means that we can count on members of the Bilderberg Group to at least try to tilt the odds or fix the game in their favor and use every available means at their disposal. Does that include political assassination? Fixing elections, creating fear in the herd by creating false flags and phony wars on terror? I believe they would, and they do.
You ever heard of something called the Vietnam War? How many people heard of Vietnam War? Well, I was talking to a college graduate not long ago who'd never heard of Watergate or President Nixon. So, all right, so there was something called the Vietnam War, and nobody reads anymore. And during that period, we were of course first we had some advisors in there. Kennedy wanted to pull us out, was assassinated. Johnson was reluctant to expand, and so they hoaxed an event or exaggerated an event called the Gulf of Tonkin incident. So get your history books open, but you can Google it. This is mainstream stuff, not conspiracy theory. And the Gulf of Tonkin, basically what we did, we hoaxed and exaggerated the attack on our ships in the Gulf of Tonkin, there near Vietnam, so that it would cause outrage in the public, outrage in Congress, and it stampeded President Johnson into vastly expanding our presence in Vietnam. Which of course enriched, guess who? The military, industrial, financial, gang-bankster complex. So trillions of dollars are at stake here. So, and it happened to cost 58,000 American lives and probably several million Southeast Asian lives on a misadventure that was completely based on a hoaxed or an exaggerated event.
A couple of key things, I think, when we look at Nixon is that he, in 1957, what's happening is Hughes' empire and the aerospace side of it is getting so huge and it's getting so powerful that what happens is he's like, most of my money's going out in taxes, because they had this incredible tax bracket back then where they took something like 80% of your profits when you reached a certain level. And he was at that level. And he said, Dick, you have to help me. You know, I'm in this situation. You need to somehow find a way to get my taxes lowered. And what he decides to do, and it's very mysterious because it gets into the whole pharmaceutical wing and how we have so many problems with the pharmaceuticals now. But this is one of the early foundation moves, which is Hughes Medical gets developed. And Hughes Medical is like, you know, oh, we need to develop cures for cancer and all these different things. But in fact, it's a mechanism whereby Hughes can basically hide all of his profits, which, remember, a lot of this is getting kind of money laundered through the CIA. Now, an extraordinary thing happens, which is Hughes has Hughes Aerospace, and he has now Hughes Medical. And what he does is he goes to Nixon and he says, I want to make Hughes Medical nonprofit. So it's a huge nonprofit. I want Hughes Aerospace to now be a part of that nonprofit entity. And nobody would ever have gone for it in Congress and all the rest of it. Somehow Nixon rifles it through. And so Hughes' huge empire dealing with aerospace suddenly becomes a nonprofit part of Hughes Medical, and therefore he's able to keep all the money and hide all the transactions. So this is incredibly important because the CIA wants to use Hughes. They want to use his money. They want to use his resources. They want to use his aerospace connections. They want to use the technology he's developing. But here now they have an incredible smokescreen to do it through, because now they have a non-profit organization, and it's a win-win because Hughes gets to keep all the money that they were going to tax. And all of this is incredibly good because Nixon's helping him do it. And it's incredibly good for Nixon because he gets Hughes' incredible backing.
You had Johnson come around, and then you had Nixon. And Nixon, by the way, was vice president for Eisenhower. Nixon actually was pulled in as head of the Space Committee. The vice president sits as chair of the Space Committee, into Majestic. This group, MAJIC, M-A-J-I-C, is actually what it's called. It's the Majority Intelligence Committee, M-A-J-I-C, it's the proper term. And MAJIC tapped Nixon, and he thought as president, he would be the guy that would disclose this, because he thought it was time, and he finally became president after Jack Kennedy, he felt, swindled him out of the presidency in 1960. And then, of course, Lyndon Johnson inherited the presidency in a sense after the assassination, had one term, part of another, the rest of Jack Kennedy's term. But Nixon thought, well, okay, I'm going to do this. And so a little thing called Watergate happened. Everybody remember Watergate? Those of you too young to remember, it was the break-in over here at this office in a luxury apartment on the Potomac. And it was a bag job. Bag men went in and broke into the Democratic National Committee offices to get lists and information, and Nixon ended up covering it up. I mean, it's kind of standard operating procedure. You know, it's like it wasn't really that big of a deal in the sense that it happens all the day, you just don't know it. But there was a guy named Woodard who was ONI. Office of Naval, you know, Bernstein, Woodard and Bernstein, look it up. And Office of Naval Intelligence is where he came from. And suddenly this young reporter has this deep throat. Well, he had an ONI guy give him the information, Office of Naval Intelligence, because Nixon was planning to blow the lid off the secrecy. And the way they took him down was by impeachment rather than by a bullet. That's actually why Nixon was impeached.
When we get into looking at how this runs, you also have to go all the way back to the era of Ronald Reagan. And I met with a colonel not long ago, before he passed away, named Colonel Holman. And Colonel Holman had been on a committee back in the Carter transition, late Carter years and early Ronald Reagan presidency, to convince the president of the need for the Strategic Defense Initiative, Star Wars. And it wasn't really getting much traction as a policy initiative in terms of conventional geopolitical exigencies and requirements until they played the last card. And he admitted to me that they went in with cherry-picked and distorted information and convinced Ronald Reagan that there was an alien threat. And of course, that's reflected in his speech to the United Nations and a few other speeches where the president said, oh, wouldn't our job of uniting the world be easier if we could unite against a common threat, alien threat? So unfortunately, you know, you had an actor from Hollywood and then a governor of California, Ronald Reagan, who was easy to move through cherry picking and spinning of information to go to the policy decision these classified projects wanted. This happens all the time in the Congress, in the White House, and in other capitals, because the people who run these unacknowledged special access projects, first and foremost, are masters of psychological warfare, psyops, and psychological and social engineering. Very good at it, extremely good at it.
Quigley was more than just your average professor. He had written a couple of books which were and are the definitive history books. of the world's greatest secret society. And it exists today. It is the hidden force that runs the world today. And Quigley himself said he knew about this group, not because he was a member of it, because he wasn't, but he was very close to it. They allowed him to see their secret documents and their private papers for several years. He had access to them because they wanted this history written. And so he spoke very glowingly of it. He said, I have no objection to it or its goals. Quigley describes how this secret society works. Their goal, of course, is world domination. And their method was to control the various nations of the world from behind the scenes. That they would select the political people that would stand up and be obvious to everybody, but they would select them. They would control them. And they would control all of the support mechanisms, the media. They would control the banks in particular. It was very important to control the money systems. And they would meet regularly to discuss policies and make decisions of what to do in the upcoming months. And the Bilderberg Group is one of those groups. Once you understand what Quigley was talking about, it perhaps is one of the most important international meetings of this secret society.
Now, up until the Federal Reserve was founded in 1913, the United States essentially was in control of its own currency. This same banking cartel that we've been talking about worked behind the scenes to create a series of fake economic crises in the late 1800s and early 1900s, which caused regular Americans to have their savings wiped out. This became such a crisis that people were desperately calling for reform. And then the government comes along and says, look, we're bribed, corrupt politicians. We don't really know what we're doing. They have spokespeople saying these kinds of things in the media. Let's bring in the investors. Let's bring in the British bankers, the people who really know how to make money. They've been doing it for a long time. They're not just going to hold an office for a few years and go disappear. They are the guys who really understand how to run a financial system. So what did we do? We handed over the issuance of American currency to a private corporation of private bankers. When you see Federal Reserve note on the US dollar, that means it's printed by the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve, since they came into power just over a century ago, has eroded the purchasing power of the US dollar by 99%.
Because we're in a position where any government, it doesn't matter what stripe it is, needs money to do essential things, and there's only two ways to get it. That's taxation or borrowing. And some of us think taxes are just about high enough already. And secondly, we've got a huge national debt, federal, $615 billion, and that's just federal. It doesn't include the provinces and the municipalities. And there are a lot of people who think we don't want to go further in debt because there's no way to pay it off. As long as the cartel has a monopoly, they create all the money as debt. And it's debt that has to be repaid, principal and interest, but nobody creates any money with which to pay either the principal or interest. So there's only one way to keep going, and that's to borrow more and keep going deeper and deeper into debt.
Since 1971, or even before then, we've been on this fiat currency system. Nearly every country in the Western world is under piles of debt. So you look at our debt to GDP ratio, and it's around 100%. I believe it's gone over 100% at the current moment. However, you look at our pension liabilities, it's a Ponzi scheme. We owe something like 7 times or more the GDP. That's everything that everyone earns in terms of income in this country for an entire year. We owe 7 years. So if you were to tax every single person in this country 50% of their income, with providing them 0 services, it would take about 14 years to pay that back.
We are in an unsustainable system. I think the fiat money system, the Ponzi scheme, is about run its course. And that's why I think the successor program with the same benefactors or beneficiaries is the carbon credits. I mean, how we ever allowed private companies the ability to create money and charge interest from it? I mean, who would ever agree to that? The power that gives those individuals.
And they get to spend the money first, which means they get to spend it when it has value.
Yeah.
So again, there's this disparity between those at the top and those below.
Well, also, when it comes to buying power and influence, if you have the ability to create money from nothing, I mean, most people have their price. It would be like me trying to bribe you with, I'll just give you buckets of air. I mean, as much, money means as much to them as buckets of air mean to me, doesn't it? Give him 5, give him 10. Doesn't make any difference, does it?
You seem like a scientifically minded man. Do the other MPs actually have any clue how the fiat money system works?
No, and they don't want to talk about it.
Any of them? Are there a small handful? Because I remember
there are a few. I mean, I think Steve Baker realised, and he wrote some books about it. There's a few people, but I think that people are just warned off. I don't think it's good for your health.
Well, to understand what I'm talking about, a little history of what money is and where it comes from can help. I had lunch with Mark Olson today, and we tried out on one of the waitresses, find out what she knew about money, and she knew a little more about it than some people, but not very much. And she knew that it was printed, but of course what she didn't know is that most of it isn't printed. And of our money supply today, I'm sure this audience would be pretty well aware of this, only 3%, roughly, is legal tender. Less than 1% of coins, less than 3% of paper, printed money that you always see in the newsreels. The other 97% are bank accounts, bank entries. And they're not real money. They're not legal tender. They're just computer entries. That's all they are. Well, then along comes Dr. Friedman and his friends at the University of Chicago, and they put in a plug for monetarism and deregulation, and that resulted in the banks being able to lend the same money 20 times. Some of them a lot more than that, but 20 times is sort of the norm. And in my opinion, that's grand larceny. You know, for a long while I've kept a file on the mafia, or mafia, if you prefer. And you'll recall that there was an investigation in Montreal not too long ago where it was alleged that the mafia had been, Sicilian mafia had been taking 2.5% off the top of all of the construction contracts in the city for years. The money mafia takes 95% off the top. So I guess if 2.5% is a good thing, 95% is better. They can invest $5 million in what I call blood, sweat, and tears money. That's the kind of money you go out and earn. Working, cutting down trees, giving haircuts, working in a shop, working in a factory. Blood, sweat, and tears because you've earned the money. But they only have to put up $5 million of that to make loans equal to $100 million. And the 100 million has to be repaid in blood, sweat, and tears money plus interest. And I don't think it's fair, for example, this wasn't a problem in my day, but it has been recently, that they can loan students $50,000 to finish their studies, and all of the blood, sweat, and tears money that they invest to do that is $2,500. But the students have to repay $50,000 in blood, sweat, and tears plus interest. And that's the way the system works. Well, the way the banks create money is this way. If you need $35,000 for a car, you go in, see your bank manager, and ask for a loan. And they'll say, well, what collateral have you got? Any stocks or bonds? If you haven't got that, second mortgage on your cottage or third mortgage on your house. And if you haven't got that, maybe a rich friend or relative that will co-sign. And when they're satisfied with the collateral, they'll ask you to sign a note for the $35,000 principal, repayable on demand, plus interest at some prime plus some rate. It used to be quite higher than it is now, but let's say 3 or 4% or 5%, depending on the color of your eyes. And the way they make their money is by what they call a spread. If you decide, oh, I left something out here, once you have signed the note, then they go over and tap their computers, and presto, $35,000 appears in your account, which you can go out and spend to buy a car. Seconds earlier, that money did not exist. And it's the biggest myth in banking that when you go in to borrow money, you're borrowing the money that I or somebody else deposited the day before. Not so. They are nearly always fully lent, and when you go in to borrow money and they give you a loan, they manufacture it out of thin air. But then you have to repay it with blood, sweat, and tears.
Do you understand the concept of the global American empire?
Yes.
That basically the petrodollar is based upon. So they invade every single country that threatens to trade oil in a currency that's not dollars.
And they use NATO as their mercenary army to take out anyone who doesn't have a central bank controlled by them.
Gaddafi, you said earlier.
Yes, well, he's one. Syria, Iran, Russia. They don't control their central banks, do they? There is, I'm sure it's just a coincidence.
And many coincidences.
There's a lot of coincidences. A lot of coincidences around, aren't there?
It's very clear from the leaks that come out of Bilderberg that they are the ones that decide who's going to be president. Who Bilderberg decides to put their power and finance behind is who becomes the next president.
The Bilderbergers are now divided up into two main camps, controlled by the Rockefeller faction and the Rothschild faction. The Rothschilds control most of the money. They control the royal houses. They control the fortunes of the Queen of England, the Queen of Spain, the kings and queens of Scandinavia. So they control mostly the financing. The Rockefellers, on the other hand, control oil and technology. That's why you always have a Secretary of State for the United States that usually comes from the Rockefeller camp. The wars that are going on inside the Bilderbergs now have more to do with technique and process than they have to do with the ultimate goal. The ultimate goal is a George Orwell 1984 style totalitarian superstate using the new technology that's coming out to enslave and oppress the entire planet. That's their goal.
Do you think the Bilderberg Group has the power to decide who will be the next president of the United States?
Absolutely. They are the ones that sort of coordinate and decide amongst the ruling classes and coordinate where their funding is going to go, who's going to get funded, who's going to get promoted, who's going to get slandered, who's going to get attacked. It's very clear from the leaks that come out of Bilderberg that they are the ones that decide who's going to be president. Who Bilderberg decides to put their power and finance behind is who becomes the next president.
No one, I think in not just the United States, but in the world, achieves any amount of power without being guilty of some great crime. They have to have something on you if you are progressing to a higher office. They've got to be able to hold the end of that leash to be able to rein you in. Lord knows what they have on Obama. Nobody is put in power unless they can blackmail them, unless they can rein them in, unless they're guilty of some grand crimes.
They're essentially communists or socialists. They want a one-world socialistic government, a big monolithic monster government that is involved in every aspect of your lives, that is sort of acts as your parent and your provider and your protector and your nanny. It's a cradle-to-grave, Big Brother, Orwellian nightmare, invasive, over-regulated, giant, monolithic, big, money-wasting government is what they want.
I think the goal is, how do we control? How do we expand our control and our rule? How do we literally dominate the world? And ideology becomes a tool, not the motivating force, but the tool to accomplish that objective. And so the tool that they have found that is most effective is collectivism. So everything, almost everything they accomplish in terms of advancing their power and control is usually explained in a very benign way as being beneficial to society. They're either protecting people against terrorism or crime or drugs or pornography or against global warming destruction, or it's all in the name of helping people in some way. And that is the earmark of collectivism. And so I think, though, that these people themselves really don't have any ideology except conquest and rule.
During the pandemic, we saw how the government was willing to help these big businesses, right, and not small businesses. Theorists such as Carol Roth, whose book we've mentioned several times on this show, says that the government doesn't like small businesses because they can't control them like they do big business. Well, then look at this list of bedfellows, right? It's hard to dispute that, knowing that these thought discussions take place between big business and government should make us weary of what big business does, and also gives us a sense that they are not just private businesses when they, so when we make this argument like, oh, Jack Dorsey can do whatever he wants with Twitter, but not if he is involved with major discussions of policy for citizens of the world, then you no longer are just like, it's your private company, you should do what you want, right?
Right.
If you have power of a politician, then this changes the nature of what we're dealing with.
I think it does. And, look, if a lot of these people are unelected and they can drive, we've seen it before, they're already doing it. Like, this is not a conspiracy theory. This is happening. As Senator Rand Paul said last week, he said, people used to talk about this as sort of a conspiracy theory. It's not. It's literally in their meeting minutes and on their agenda on what they plan to do.
Yeah.
They've told us what they plan to do. It's laid out in front of us. I guess, as I've talked about here on the show, Catherine Austin Fitts has written about this extensively. You just go through what they're actually saying, and you see them implementing this, whether it's an electric power grid control, buying up land, consolidation of power under one digital currency, so that you track everything that we are doing, vaccine passports, like all of these things for control, because that's what they want, is absolute control.
I mean, we've been talking about this growing use of the word cabal, right? Mm-hmm. And it used to be just something that conspiracy theorists said, but really we are seeing more and more evidence that these groups of unelected people exert their influence in the shadows. And this, I mean, I guess they're willing to put on nice clothes and go say we're doing these things and we want to talk about nice things, but really this is what it is.
Yeah.
Here's the thing. If you look at all the terms and conditions on your bank accounts, your credit cards, that's where the control grid is moving in. So we've just had a huge brouhaha where the IRS tried to say to get your refund, you needed a biometric ID, and Congress made them back down.
Yes. They were like, you need facial recognition.
That's the control grid going into place. And I'm sympathetic. In this one, I'm sympathetic to the IRS because if you look at the fraud they deal with on the refunds, it's frightening. So, they're under siege on the refunds, and I'm sympathetic with they're trying to deal with it.
What's the end goal of CBDC?
Complete control. I mean, if you go to Celery.com and click on Cash Friday, you can pull up a video. I don't know. Can you show it in the video? It's 56 seconds.
Yeah.
Hold on. Can you share the screen? Let me just pull it up. This is Karstens, the general manager of the Bank and International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland. And this is October 2020 at a IMF panel on cross-border payments. And when he said this, it was Jerome Powell, the chairman of the Federal Reserve. I thought he was going to piss in his pants when he said this. It was so funny. Hold on. Okay, here we go.
Analysis on CBDC, in particular for the use of general use, we tend to establish the equivalence with cash, and there is a huge difference there. For example, in cash, we don't know, for example, who's using a $100 bill today. We don't know who is using a 1,000 peso bill today. A key difference with the CBDC is that central bank will have absolute control on the rules and regulations that will determine the use of that expression of central bank liability. And also we will have the technology to enforce that. Those two issues are extremely important, and that makes a huge difference with respect to what cash is.
And it's funny because I would tell people about the control grid and why they had to be concerned and blah, blah, blah. And they would go like, yeah. And then I play this for them and they go nuts because they suddenly can feel it. They can feel the trap closing in on them.
Yes.
And they're like, oh my God.
From the World Economic Forum, when they go into you won't own anything, it's 2030, but you'll like it. That's one of those things that's waking people up.
Do you like it? Oh yeah, I like it. So, I always tell everybody what it means is it's 2030. We stripped you of your assets and your mind controlled.
Yes.
And if you don't say you like it, we'll turn off your credit card.
Right. And you won't be able to drive, and no pizza.
No pizza.
We're dealing with, the same old nexus that occurred during the war between American business and the Nazis. This nexus continues after the war.
Yeah, they continue to do business. And I want to throw in a couple of other things. We see the 47 and 49 Act, the National Security Act and the CIA Act passed in 47 and 49, which gives the U.S. government the ability to appropriate money and then shift that money out of the agency it's designated for and have it disappear into the black budget on a non-accountable basis. So that's one. Then we see the second thing is the United States literally opened up to the drug trade coming from, where did it come from? Latin America. and that money is literally used to lever the money in the black budget, and it's completely non-accountable. That's then laundered with mortgage securities and government securities fraud, which levers it to an even greater amount. But then to me, what the coup d'etat, you ready for the coup d'etat? In 1980, George H.W. Bush, former head of the CIA, takes control. His deal with Reagan is he runs National Security Council and all intelligent enforcement. That was the deal when he went on the ticket. He takes over and they engineer an executive order that qualifies private corporations to do secret and highly classified functions paid for by the U.S. government. So now you've not only have you created a $1 trillion budget, but now it can finance private corporations owning and controlling the most advanced technology in the world on a completely non-transparent, non-accountable basis.
This is precisely the same structure that I'm seeing, Catherine. This nexus of people, high-level bureaucrats within intelligence, and the private corporate world with black budgets and secret research into technology. The bad side of this is, since you mentioned Latin America and the drug trade and how American intelligence penetrated this, the other side of that coin is that the on-the-ground penetration by American intelligence of these drug cartels is being handled by the soldiers on the ground who are, guess what, Nazis. And the reason I say that, there's an excellent book out by a fellow by the name of Henrik Kruger, and I cite this work in the Nazi International, the book of that title that I wrote. And Kruger points out that it's during the 60s and 70s that there's a massive restructuring of the way that the global drug trade is conducted, and the people behind this are attempting to take the French out of the picture. You know, this would explain many of the attempts on General de Gaulle's life. And the people behind this are attempting to restructure it, and as they're doing so, you find this huge penetration of the international drug trade by these post-war fascist networks, for want of a better expression. So you've got yet another nexus here in this breakaway civilization. You're dealing with vast amounts of very criminal money, as you point out, being laundered through banks, through government securities, and so on and so forth. And this whole vast enterprise, in turn, looks to be supporting some sort of vast secret research project of some sort. So yeah, I'm in total agreement with you. This is exactly what I've been finding in my research. And the question it raises to my mind, Catherine, is what are they doing with all of this money? It's obvious how they're laundering it, you know, mortgages and bonds and securities and derivatives and so on and so forth. But what are they using it for? And again, I go back to the fact that if we're dealing with technologies such as the Nazi bell, if on top of this you have an increasing, you know, phenomenally increasing presence of something in our skies, usually over military bases, and no one really knows what it is, then this is going to become a hot-button national security issue. And that, in turn, is going to foster a great deal of hidden and secret research. And I suspect that this is, in part, what explains it. I also suspect, like you put it earlier, that this has functioned as a slush fund for all sorts of covert operations and covert political activities. But, you know, if all of this is true, then yes, we're looking at a breakaway civilization of some sort.